So today we're going to dive into a transformative conversation about the power of narrative identity in leadership. These are the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, what we're capable of, and how we navigate challenges, and then how they directly shape our leadership effectiveness. In this webinar, Steve Athey will guide us through how our personal and collective narratives influence our decision making, relationships, and impact. And we'll explore how shifting these stories can unlock new levels of creativity, authenticity, and leadership growth. So, if you're ready to examine the narratives that drive you and learn how to rewrite them for greater influence and success, you're in the right place. So, to kick us off, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker today. I'm honored to introduce Steve Athey. Steve is a senior partner here at Leadership Circle. He's got over 30 years of experience and has worked at the cutting edge of leadership development, helping senior executives and their teams achieve profound and unsustainable growth in both performance and consciousness. As a master coach and trusted advisor, Steve has been instrumental in pioneering high performance team building strategies, culture shifting simulations, and innovative approaches to adult stage development. So his most recent work, which we're going to talk about today, explores narrative identity and self-authorship, which integrates leadership, personal growth, and well-being. Steve has a background spanning biology, psychotherapy, and of course, leadership consulting. Steve brings a unique and deeply human perspective to his work and has collaborated with Fortune 500 companies, global organizations, and institutions like McDonald's, American Express, EY, and even the US Navy. Beyond his professional impact, Steve is an avid river runner, skier, and cyclist. You have to ask him about his robots and his ski boots. And then often using the outdoor environment as a training ground for leadership development. So please join me in welcoming Steve Athey. And Steve, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Welcome, everybody. It's good to see everybody. Um, so this session we're going to talk about narrative identity, kind of in a compressed format, at least to highlight what it is, how we think about it, its impact on leadership. And I'll start by kind of setting the stage. How should we think about narrative identity? What is it? And then we'll move to, I'll tell you three different stories of three different leaders and their own kind of narrative identity and how it impacted their leadership. And then we'll kind of conclude before the Q&A with some thoughts about what does development look like across sort of a narrative identity journey. So that'll be our work of today. So just to set the stage here, one way to think about narrative is as it's one of the primary construction materials of identity. Because for us human beings, narrative is one of our most powerful kind of sense-making capabilities. We use it then to construct this story of the self. So the term narrative identity has been around a while, 30 plus years. It really comes from narrative psychology, which is really the newest branch of personality psychology. And in its simplest terms, narrative identity is the story we tell ourselves about who we've been, who we are, and who we're going to be. Dan McAdams, a professor at Northwestern, has kind of been a pioneer in this space. He describes narrative identity as kind of a three-part construction that consists of a curated past, an experienced present, and an imagined future. So we'll take kind of each of those in turn and kind of unpack those. So curated past, let's imagine one of those flip books, that you kind of riffle through and it animates a story. It's kind of like a cartoon story usually. And imagine that flip book is made up of your entire life from birth to present moment. Every page, an experience, a thought, a relation, an emotion, interaction, an occurrence, a circumstance, an event. And now imagine that in order to construct a coherent, durable identity, a durable self, one that can hang together through time, in other words, a storied self, you must kind of, as the poet Diane de Prima said, select out of an infinite sea of possibilities those pages in that flip book that are going to be fundamental elements of that identity, that story. So over time, all the other pages in your flip book gradually kind of fade to white. And now there's only a few pages left that kind of catch your eye, only a few pages left that capture your attention, that drive the narrative forward. So that act of selection of what's important and what's not important is an act of curation. You think about the Smithsonian Museum, for instance. At last count, the Smithsonian had 157 million objects in its collection, but less than 1% of that was on display at any given time. Same thing, curation, right? We have this vast past out of which we pick a few things to create an identity out of. Another analogy for the curated past is if you imagine the night sky of a billion stars. That's this next slide, Andrew. So the curated past is the privileging of some of those stars in such a way that it creates a constellation of self, right? If you animate that slide, yeah, there you go. So again, you've created a constellation of self, again, out of infinite possibility, out of these billions of stars. Some of these stars get privileged. They become part of the story. So this is the narrative identity, the storied self through which we experience life. And the second part of the narrative identity is the experienced present. So if the curated past is kind of an architecture of self through which we experience our day-to-day lives, then the day-to-day experience is the way in which we live that architecture in the present moment. So go back to this morning as you started your day, sort of fully clothed in your story of yourself. You walked into this webinar fully storied, a self ready, pre-patterned for circumstance. And whatever story you walked in with, my bet is that it was a deeply familiar one. It's a self with rituals, with behaviors, with attitudes, with thoughts, with emotions, all queued up, ready to fit the story you tell yourself about who you are. And that story has plenty of evidence to support kind of its lived reality, its substance, its realness. It's an embodied story that's logical, consistent, coherent. It's a present that's explained by the past. So right now, my words are likely landing in your story somehow. This narrative of who you've been, the curated past, orients the action of today, the experienced present. So the third element here, the third dimension of a narrative identity, is the imagined future. For the story to be coherent, the thread of the past must weave into and through the present, giving rise to a future that's explained by that past and that present. Now, for most of us, there are sure to be dramatic turning points in our stories. There's arcs of redemption or catastrophe. There's probably multiple re-renderings of the past in order to make sense of the present moment and to ultimately have some sense of the future. So the imagined future is a world populated by possible selves, right? All the me's that could arise from that curation of the past. The explosion of possible selves typical in adolescence, right? When anything's possible, that could be anybody. Oftentimes in midlife is kind of betrayed by circumstance. It's kind of whittled down to maybe a few essential but insufficient few selves. A poverty of kind of possible selves is often experienced as depression or despair. The future doesn't look very bright if that's all I can be. So that's the basic model, right? A particular curation of our past and the associated meanings that gives rise to an everyday mode of kind of experiencing our present, and ultimately the lens in which we imagine the future through. That's the primary narrative structure of our lives, and it has a profound effect on the quality of that life and the way in which we lead. So let's meet some leaders here and kind of peer into their story a bit and their self-making, their narrative identities, and how it's shaped their lives and their leadership. So James, we'll take James first here. James is a HR VP in his early 50s. He's in charge of talent and leadership development at a large corporation. James is angry. He's just been told that he's topped out in his career. He's been told that he's not promotable above his current VP level. He recently submitted his application to take the place of the retiring CHRO, and he's been told that he doesn't have the requisite leadership skills to climb any farther, that he's too nice, that he's not tough enough to make the hard calls, that his tendency to avoid conflict will be a problem. You know, as hard as that message is, he knows that much of that feedback is accurate. He's been a lifelong people pleaser. He's got very strong relational skills. You know, in our 360 assessment instrument, the Leadership Circle, he scores at about the 70th percentile in caring about others, collaborating well, showing up as a selfless leader with a strong internal set of personal values. But at what we call the complying dimension, which is negatively correlated with effective leadership, made up of the tendency to operate from sort of pleasing and belonging, sort of a low risk conservative nature, and the passivity in leadership. He scores at about the 75th percentile. So he's quite high in those complying kinds of strategies. You know, he knows this about himself, and he's tired. He's tired of being that guy. He's tired of watching himself swallow his words. He's tired of constantly acquiescing to less capable but more vocal peers. So he's kind of at a stuck place in his story of himself. So in order to kind of help James, let's hear some of the rest of his story. What were the origins of this pattern of knowing himself as a nice guy? Why did it make sense psychologically? Why was it logical for James as a kid to adopt this particular set of identity strategies in early life? James was the middle of three kids. His older brother was kind of a ne'er-do-well, kind of a troublemaker. His younger sister had a pretty profound learning disability. His mother had kind of a bright, loving spirit, but that brightness often waned as she was fighting this long kind of trench warfare battle with a pervasive cancer that had persisted across most of her adulthood. Father was hardworking, but
Go
passive.
ahead. Fine. We're not going anywhere fast.
Father was a hardworking but passive guy, given to depression, sometimes really critical cynicism. In that household, dinner time conversation was typically cycling through three topics: mom's state of health or disease on any given day, his older brother's drinking and drug use and run-ins with the law, his sister's loneliness and difficulties at school. James was a frequent witness to mom's buoyant and sometimes fragile cheerfulness, kind of running up against dad's depressive and silent moods. James he came to dread the aftermath of that, the light kind of going out of the house for days. So here's this kid. He's terrified of losing his mother permanently. He's terrified of causing her any kind of distress, acutely aware of how much she longed for stability and harmony and health and happiness in the family. So what did James do? He learned how to be a very good boy. He was a model citizen, good grades, polite to adults, never disruptive, friendly and engaging, interested in everybody, wonderful best friend, conversational. He would do just about anything to keep the house stable, anything that would keep his mom alive, anything that would keep his father from sliding into kind of a crippling depression, anything that would keep his brother out of alcoholism and jail, and his sister from lifelong disappointment. James's desires, his wants and needs always took a backseat to all those other more critical anxieties. So, like all of us, James's childhood wounds kind of laid the groundwork for his adult capacities. He's a master at making people feel comfortable and valued and respected. He's got a broad circle of friends and colleagues, many of them considering themselves special in his eyes. After college and grad school, his natural gifts made him a rising star in the HR world. But there was one sort of conclusion that young James reached regarding his childhood. It was this: it's not safe to rock the boat. That boat and that family system could go down at any minute with all hands. Somebody had to keep it stable. So, given that sort of narrative heart of that story, that blueprint, if you will, what strategies emerged for him? Well, hypervigilance regarding conflict and distress, caution, kind of cloaked in a cheerful disposition, self-sacrifice in service, kind of an all-important harmony, swallowing of voice, dampening of personal power. You can hear the gifts in the story. You can see why he's been successful in his career. It's all those relational gifts. But you can also begin to hear the liabilities. So James is in this narrative tight spot, this narrative constriction. The old story chafes and compresses. The story he's told himself about who he is and how he came to be that person is logical and deeply familiar. He's not sure he can afford to believe it anymore because the future it promises is not enough. So let's talk now about Victoria. So Victoria, COO of a large multinational, she's in her mid-50s, last several years groomed to be the next CEO. She's had a stellar career, advancing quickly up through the ranks. She's achieved, in a sense, all the goals of that identity project, kind of fabulous career, lots of recognition and acclaim, piles of money, loving family and husband. But the challenge for her right now in midlife is kind of this growing emptiness and exhaustion and despair. Why is the idea that, once so coveted of becoming the next CEO, why does that feel so empty, so flat, so lifeless? When we look at her data through kind of the lens of the leadership circle model, she's in the 99th percentile in lots of those highly effective competencies: courageous authenticity, purposeful and visionary, achieving results, decisive.
Listening so quickly.
She's in the 90th percentile above in things like composure and interpersonal intelligence and systems awareness and strategic focus. She doesn't score particularly highly in life balance or selfless leader. And then in terms of the characterological patterns that show up in her leadership that are negatively correlated with effective leadership, she frequently operates in what we call the controlling space, leading from kind of overdrive and perfection and ambition. So how did Victoria come to know herself in this way? Why did it make sense psychologically? Why was it logical for her in early life to adopt this kind of particular set of identity strategies, the success at all costs strategies? How did that become the story of her life? Victoria was the oldest of four kids in this kind of abject, extreme poverty. Grew up in the Southwest U.S. in a trailer park. Her father was a violent drunk and addict. Mom was a sweet but depressive alcoholic. The household was chaotic with unpredictable violence. On any given day, there could be encounters with the police. There could be threats of violence, typical shady characters hanging around, neglect, abuse, the ever-present fear of being evicted. By the time she was about 7, Victoria was the de facto mother of that family, protecting her younger siblings from the rages of her father, insulating them from sort of the soul-crushing neglect of her mom, cooking, cleaning, parenting as best she could in her little girl's body. She grew up fast and hard, developed a foundational core that insisted on forward motion, doing the best she could, taking care of those less able, always hiding her own fears and insecurities and disappointments. When she was a freshman in high school, her father finally went to prison permanently after killing a guy in a bar fight. Victoria by then was a straight A student, caretaker of her mother to her younger siblings. And for the first time in her life, she found some hope of escape and hope of a life completely different from what she'd experienced in those first 15 years. And she doubled down on that hope. She fully committed to pursuing excellence kind of in everything she did, piled up achievement after achievement during her high school years, graduated at the top of her class, got a full ride scholarship at the state university, maintained a 4.0 while holding down a full-time job, while continuing to take care and be the matriarch of the family. So lots of career success followed. She quickly rose up through the ranks of several large companies, kind of her career reaching its apogee as the CEO of this highly successful multinational. So if there's one core conclusion reached by young Victoria regarding her childhood, it was this: the world's a dangerous place, and it's not safe to be little. So given the narrative heart of that story of self, what strategies emerged? Well, if it's dangerous to be little, then I need to be big all the time. I need to be powerful, forward motion at all costs. I need to have kind of an unassailable success once I get out of here. Relentless pursuit up the next rung of the achievement ladder, victory at all costs. She built a whole life on that set of strategies. And you can hear the gifts emerging in the story: positivity, optimism, relentless capacity for achievement and results. Built an amazing life on top of incredible adversity and challenge. Problem now, though, she's having trouble imagining following that same path into the future. The idea of spending the next 5 to 7 years of her life as the CEO, it just makes her sad. Continuing to live in that story of achievement and success and drive seems empty and almost soulless. So she's stuck. She's stuck in a story, just like James is stuck in a story. And finally, we grew up Mason. Mason's a strategic leader in a Fortune 500 company running a critical business unit. Growth has stalled significantly in the business unit, and the recent strategy refresh that he led is not bearing any significant results. His leadership team is fracturing. The infighting that they're doing far outweighs the team's external focus on the market or the competition. In our data set, in our 360, Mason scores really highly in courageous authenticity and strategic focus. He's kind of middle of the road in systems awareness and achieving kinds of competencies. And he's about the 10th percentile in the relating competencies. Mason's primary leadership pattern is to lead from a detached, critical, and arrogant stance, which we call the protecting pattern. He scores in or above the 90th percentile in those three patterns. He also scores really highly in autocratic. So this is a guy who leads primarily from his head, from rational intellect, little attunement to relational considerations. His overall leadership effectiveness is about the 25th percentile. Interestingly, when we look at Mason's own self-scores on the same instrument, they're virtually identical to the scores of his evaluators. This points to the fact that he knows this pattern of his. He knows that pretty profoundly about himself. It's in fact, his core identity. So Mason's business unit is poised to miss its financial target for the third year in a row when he finds himself stuck in this narrative identity that's too small for the context and challenge he faces. His story of himself does not contain the capacities he needs to successfully navigate these leadership challenges. So again, if we look back at his life, what drove these particular strategies? Why did it make sense for him to adopt these? Mason was given up for adoption by his teenage mom. He languished as a baby for about 9 months in the sort of state foster care system. He eventually got adopted by a family that had 2 other adopted children and 3 kids of their own. Within the bounds of their fundamentalist religion, kind of dogmatic morality, his adoptive parents loved him, but for Mason, it was kind of an isolating, conditional contract for care and affection. So you toe the party line, nurturance was forthcoming, but any kind of deviance from the narrow family boundaries of what was to be thought or felt or said or believed was met with either kind of a harsh moralistic rebuke or, more often than not, sort of grim, disappointed silence and exclusion. At about age 12, Mason began to recognize that he was gay. And his family surround had really zero capacity for that revelation. And he was ill-equipped for any serious disclosure with friends and had no role models to offer him any advice or direction or solace. And his life thus far had been a repetition of people not wanting him. First his birth mother, then the state, then his adoptive family, and now maybe the world. So Mason, in his isolation, had developed a capacity for solitude, an observing and analytical mind. School was easy for him. Books were his refuge. That intellectual loner outsider persona really suited him. If the world didn't want him, he would build a character that didn't want the world. Breezing through college and grad school, he developed a reputation for original thought, brilliant analysis, quick wit, withering criticism. Big 3 consulting firms couldn't wait to get a hold of him. So if there's one conclusion sort of at the core reached by young Mason regarding his life, it was this: it's not safe to want love or connection. And probably its corollary, it's not safe to love or connect. So given that narrative heart of that identity, that blueprint, you can imagine the strategies that came out, right? Smartest guy in the room, low tolerance for anybody not his intellectual equal, preference for his own company, active shunning of connection and intimacy bids. So his narrative identity is strong, it's coherent. The past explains the present. The future has a pretty familiar trajectory, but the reality is he's lonely. That identity blueprint of it's not safe to want love or connection is up against kind of an emerging opposite. The possibility that it might be dangerous to not have love and connection. And his present form of leadership has reached its limit. His present form of leadership, that clinical, aloof rationality, the brilliant mind that has little need for others' input, that embodied arrogance that keeps the world at a safe remove, it's run its course. It's achieved what it can achieve, but he's up against a context in which it's not going to be successful. So he's stuck. He's narratively stuck. All 3 of these leaders are narratively stuck in a story that keeps them kind of trapped. So when we reach these times in our life when we're stuck in our own story, we're narratively trapped, we're faced with the developmental challenge to consciously author ourselves forward, to no longer be content with just living out our lives as the protagonist in our story, following its familiar arc, constrained by the narrowness of its possibilities. We're called to pick up the pen, to become the author of our own stories in our own lives. We have to consciously confront the self-made mythologies that kind of vie for our futures. We have to find ways to loosen our narratives, to develop more freedom from our long-held stories of self, to risk leaving the safety and the security of those narrative holding cells. So how might the narrative arcs of Victoria's exhaustion, Mason's loneliness, James's anger, serve the creation of a differently storied self? If we think about sort of the narrative identity journey, we can think about that in kind of three stages. The first stage is awareness. You can advance that slide. There you go. How can I begin to confront the story that I've been living in? How do I begin to see that story as object from the outside in instead of just being subject to it? Often helpful here is attending to data sources. This might be 360 feedback data, it might be interview data, it might be performance review data or stakeholder data, could be conversational data from stakeholders or colleagues or families. What patterns arise in that data? So this is pattern recognition work. And what you'll find is that you'll find repeating patterns of identity across contexts, ways in which I've approached challenge, conflict, opportunity, relationship, etc., across varied contexts. Those patterns of kind of enactment provide a lens into the story. Who is this person? What are they up to? What do they care about? What are their capacities? What are they missing? That third person perspective allows for some real healthy objectivity. Taking perspective on ourself in story, right? And ultimately, we're going to pivot back to first person. Okay, this is my story. How do I take ownership and accountability for that story? That move to ownership is also a move to authorship. If I can see myself as an author here, not merely the person in this story, the person stuck in this story, then I can begin to experiment with the text. So the second stage here is experimentation, running lots of what you might think of as kind of high frequency, low risk, no regret experiments with my leadership. That fires up a learning cycle, right? If I'm running experiments every day in my leadership, finding lots of ways to kind of purposefully transgress on that dominant narrative that I'm stuck in. So for James who's pissed off because he's been told he's topped out at his career, his experiments are probably going to be with experimenting with his power and his voice. Speaking first, challenging a group opinion or decision, risking the displeasure of others, going against the grain, wading into conflict, rocking the damn boat. All experiments designed to take on that old story of him, that nice guy story. For Victoria, her experiments might be taking the foot off the gas, using some of her embarrassingly large accruement of vacation time to sit on a beach and maybe contemplate a different future, to actually seriously entertain not taking the CEO job, restarting her yoga practice, scheduling long weekends with her daughters and her granddaughters. Experiments all designed to transgress against the driven achiever narrative that had so shaped her life. The narrative in which you've been so afraid to step off that train. For Mason, joining a guitar club, he'd played for years, but never with others. Restarting the strategy project with deliberate involvement of the entire extended leadership team, hearing their thoughts, their experiences, their recommendations, their fears. In those forums, practicing speaking last versus first, building and connecting other points of view, playing a synergistic connector role, leaving his office door open half the day, simple things, all designed to confront the old pattern, all designed to loosen up that narrative, loosen up the grip of that old story. the more we can loosen the narrative, the more landscape opens up, the more narrative space opens up, the more capacities we can potentially unlock. And the third stage here is really all about integration. So taking all that awareness of pattern, taking full ownership of that narrative, taking all that newfound knowledge of the shape and power of that identity story, honoring obviously what it's given them, but also facing the liabilities, facing the limitations, harnessing the discoveries from those hundreds of little leadership experiments, beginning to experience the liberation of that, feeling the narrative loosening, catching kind of the temporal shifts in their language, standing in a self now that's kind of looking back at a former self saying, I used to be like that. I used to do that. Now I'm doing this. This is who I am now. So feeling the power of the conscious authorship of the self, new capacities start to come online. New life kind of begins to unfold in front. So that, my friends, is a brief introduction to narrative identity work in leadership. And I'd love at this point to take some questions. We'll hold on these slides, Andrew. We don't need these at this point.
All right. We've got a question here in the chat from Peter who says, how does someone in their 70s step back and realize that it's not too late to redefine their story? And how has it become distorted over the decades? They're thinking it's just not worth it. So how do you talk to somebody in that regard?
Yeah. It's interesting if you read into the sort of gerontology studies in narrative, and that's where a fair amount of this work started, is actually in gerontology. The notion of older folk getting caught and stuck in such a persistent story of themselves that they either begin to despair and lose hope and feel almost rigidly locked in that story, compared to other elderly folks same age who seemingly were able to continue to refresh their story of themselves, even with the loss of their peer group around them, maybe loss of a spouse, et cetera, all the things that come with aging. So both possibilities exist, are out there. Part of it, I think, is really honoring the story for what it's given you, and then facing the limitations of it, because it's the constrained future that often is painful if it's not the way I'm experiencing the present moment. And then the pathway is really similar. It's taking ownership for that. It's stepping into some experiments, maybe small, again, low risk, no regret kinds of experiments, and trying some new things. So really a similar pathway that I just kind of explicated here in terms of what a leader's journey might be. One of the tragic parts of some of the narrative research is something they call narrative foreclosure. That's that old person that's stuck in a nursing home somewhere who's stopped telling themselves the story of themselves. And they're just waiting to die. They're just kind of housed in the warehouse of that nursing home. And further losing the capacity to kind of take on their own narrative. And sometimes that's complicated by obviously dementia and Alzheimer's and other things that limit our capacity to do that work.
Right. We've got quite a few interesting questions over here in the chat. Steve, Delta's asking, how do you introduce this concept really to a leader to help them be comfortable exploring it rather than becoming defensive?
Yeah. It's one of my favorite parts about the narrative work is it's so accessible. I mean, everybody knows that we're all storytellers. It's the way we make sense of the world. So it's not a super complex idea. It's not overly academic for most leaders. Once you can briefly explain yeah, let's get a handle on, what's your story of yourself? It's pretty easy to drop right into that conversation without a lot of, theoretical scaffolding around it. It's a very human to human conversation. So I've actually found that one of the things that I've enjoyed the most about this work is how how human friendly it is, if you will, and how accessible it is to leaders. So you don't really need the theory to drop into, what's your story? How have you constructed that story?
Great. Angel is asking, is there a narrative uh, that brings out the best in ourselves? Is there maybe a singular narrative that does?
Well, I mean, some of the research points to things you would probably not find surprising that somebody who has kind of a growth mindset, somebody who has a curiosity capacity, uh, somebody whose stories kind of have a redemptive or a resilience arc, um, tend to have better health outcomes and well-being outcomes. Um, Now that said, I wouldn't kind of push everybody through that pipe. I think the one thing I've noticed with a lot of practitioners, especially early on in their kind of picking up some of this work, is they kind of get in their heads that this is all about just creating the next version of myself. That's what the most important thing is. That may be important, but it's actually not the most important thing. The most important thing is developing the capacity for authorship, is to always be paying attention to story, always be paying attention to how I'm storying myself, always being curious about that, versus just locking myself into yet another story of self, which again may be useful and important, but I think the developing the capacity for authorship is the gold there.
Great. Um, Steve's asking, where do people mess up while they're in the midst of changing their narrative?
Um, that's a good question. I think they could, I mean, I think they could give up. I mean, that might be one thing. It's too hard, which I don't see
Yeah.
very often. Most people can get into at least making those experimental moves, which is what opens everything up, without too much difficulty. As long as they don't try to change everything at once, they just try to, try a few things and then get into a learning cycle of that. How is that informing who I think I am? Um, Maybe having an expectation, to go back to the prior question, maybe having an expectation of that story needs to be a particular thing or a way, would maybe another place they could get stuck. Uh, Versus again, kind of leaning into, wait a minute, I'm authoring this as I go. I can make choices every day about this. Yeah.
Okay. Joyce has got an interesting question here. She says the concept of narrative arcs intrigues me. It appears to be often caused by external events, as you told in the stories earlier, but in what ways might these narrative arcs be, say, self-authored or self-initiated even?
Yeah. I think there is choicefulness in those strategies we adopt. They aren't purely um, created by external events. I think there's an essentialness to at least the three stories I told you guys were those were kind of essential strategies given the context of that family surrounding each of those strategies. But even in that, kids are making different choices, right? Uh, James's older brother was making a different choice. He was sitting in that same family, environment, but he made the choice to author himself as the rebel, as the troublemaker, so there's both agency there as well as surround that are at play. Uh, so one of the things I think I've paid attention to with my three, and mine are, all in their 30s now, is trying to help them develop that authorship capacity early on and take accountability for it. Not just be victim of circumstance or environment, and to take accountability for their choices in that identity formation.
Well, now I know what we're talking about at dinner in my house. Um, Dan is asking here, how do you help a person use their story to want to self-develop, not just be led into it? It's an interesting question.
Mm. Yeah, if I'm hearing you right here, Dan, you're kind of asking the question around, what's the coach's role here versus the client's role, or the leader's role. I know for me, I'm perfectly okay with them doing nothing. It's not my job to make them do anything. Um, my job is to kind of stand by side with them and be curious about, what sense they're making of this stuff. But I don't have a investment in them doing anything particular. So to be clear about my role in that is the way I kind of organize myself around that question.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's a legitimate and valid choice to stay stuck. It's one way to say that.
We'll keep going on. We got time for a few more
Mila,
questions here. Um,
Daddy cannot make it in time, so I'm gonna send it to
just
school,
a,
okay?
just a reminder, if you can, please keep yourself on mute while we're going through. Um, this is from Guy Roper. He says, or she, does reframing fit in this framework? Uh, Identifying the strengths, capacities within childhood limitations. For example, stories of shyness also include sensitivity and awareness of the environment.
Yeah. So one of the practices here, and we didn't talk about it, but in that exploration of sort of that curated past is to be curious about what's being left out, to be curious about experiences, capacities, strengths, that somehow got either left behind or forgotten, because there's a lot of richness there in that past. So yeah, reframing could be one of the ways I would call that, is just pulling out some of those capacities from the past. That would be a recuration to a degree of the past. For instance, in my life, I was a really shy, sensitive kid, and kind of highly attuned to nature and interiority. And then over the course of my childhood and early adulthood, kind of armored that up in a typical masculine way and began to lose touch with some of that. And it was later in my, 40s that I began to want to re-access that sensitive, shy kid in me, because there was capacities there that he had that I wanted and needed and kind of was afraid I had lost. So I don't know whether that's reframing or just rediscovering some of that, but I think that's the way I think about it. Yeah.
Tracy's got a good question. Would you ever have someone rewrite their narrative from different perspectives, say from the perspective of the victim, the hero, the friend?
Yeah. Well, we do a lot of character work in this work with narrative. And one of the things we do is have them identify certain characters. What's this character, care about? What are their rules for life for you? And so, if we're in a room with people there, they might identify 4 or 5 different characters that all have kind of competing interests and competing rules for life. And some of them may be more dominant than others. And then having the actual leader talk to these characters, talk to these parts of self. Again, that's a little bit of a subject-object move. I'm seeing this cast of characters as a collection of selves, none of which is the entire self of me. And then you can begin to kind of ask those characters to do different things. And well, I need you to be a little less dominant. I'm actually looking for more from the quiet character over here. So it's helping them step into that authorship role of all of those characters that are showing up in that personality and that identity.
Great. There are so many good questions over here. I'm trying to figure out which ones to do. Why don't we do this one? What resources, books, or research do you recommend to better understand this concept and how to practically utilize it with clients? This is from Christine.
Yeah. Thank you, Christine. Yeah, anything by Dan McAdams, that's a great place to start. Lots of research articles, lots of good books. Um, that's kind of a good place to start, just from a basic understanding of narrative. Um, if you want to read academic articles, there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of them. So just, you can search on anything from narrative therapy articles, narrative gerontology articles, narrative studies around different kind of identity structures, adolescence. There's so much out there. But yeah, start with McAdams. That's a good place to start.
Right. We'll maybe do two more questions and then we'll wrap up. Steve, another question that's coming through outside the chat is, rewriting personal narratives, of course, can be uncomfortable, especially when they challenge some of those deeply held beliefs. What are some strategies that leaders can use to navigate the discomfort that comes during this kind of identity rewrite or identity transformation?
Yeah, I think, at least in my experience, most of the discomfort is because of the existing narrative, not the new one. Um, and they may get, you're not trying to force anything here. You're not trying to force a new narrative. You're not trying to force um, any particular outcome. You're just inviting curiosity about the existing narrative, about its limitations, about its gifts, um, and then opening up the way of sort of experimenting into maybe new story. But the new story is often coming through those experiments. It's not a cognitive exercise where I'm going to sit down and write this new story of myself necessarily. A lot of the work we're doing is embodied kind of somatic work. The character work is a lot of somatic work. Uh, the uh, the exploration of the past is often done in pairs or triads. So it's not about them, locking themselves in a room and creating a new story of themselves. It's them experiencing the story evolving through their experiments and their shifts. It's evolving through their conversations with others. It's evolving through their own somatic awareness that's opening up some doors for them.
Right. Let's do one last question and then we'll wrap up. It says, what role does narrative identity play in leading teams through change?
Great
And
question.
yeah, how
Great
can
question.
leaders use storytelling to foster that alignment, resilience, and a shared vision?
Yeah. We're doing a lot of that work where the initial work is kind of at the individual level, where we're kind of building this narrative muscle around their own stories. We're doing some of that character work. They're kind of taking on their own story and being curious about that, all transparently in service of later in the process, usually 3 or 4 months later, bringing the team together to kind of confront the team narrative. What's the story of us? Story of us in this particular environment, in this particular industry, in this particular moment of time, using the same skills, but now pointing those skills at the team narrative or the organizational narrative, which is really fun because they've kind of begun to master some of those capabilities at the individual level. And now we're using that same set of skills to take on a bigger narrative. So that's a way we're using that a lot.
Right. Terrific. Well, Steve, thanks so much for being here. I appreciate that. Appreciate everybody being here and your participation. Thanks so much. If you're interested in bringing the leadership circle and narrative identity into your organization, just head over to the chat and type yes. That's all you got to do, and we'll reach out to you. Of course, we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar probably by the end of the week, so be on the lookout for that. And we encourage you to learn more about Leadership Circle and about the narrative identity by heading to our website. So thanks again for joining. I'll just to kind of quickly wrap up here. Just to see here. On behalf of Steve, Athey and Leadership Circle, my name is Andrew Parker. Thanks again for your time, your engagement, your commitment to personal and professional growth, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you. And in the meantime, remember that creative leaders don't wait and that you can make a difference in the world today. Take care, and we'll see you on our next webinar.